the topic is something which is something that I think about a lot, actually, mainly because we're not doing it very well. And I, in the title, I put CBR, and I'm not sure if that's something that people who haven't done astronomy are familiar with, but that's cosmic reputation. So it's just like just everything. It's as far as I'm concerned, reputation is something that is in the background of everything, and is a part of what we do. And the fact that that doesn't really register with a lot of my colleagues is something that's very difficult to deal with a lot of the time. Because in our institutions here in Japan, we mostly have people who are not career communicators. They're people who are generalists. They're working on very different subjects in different parts of the university, and they happen to get rotated into the PR function. So they tend to look at the work in a very task-oriented way. And they look at what their predecessors were doing. They look at what contracts the office has with different vendors. And they're looking at output. They're looking at different publications or different parts of the website or something like this. And so all of these tasks are very clear to them. There's money associated with them. There are people associated with them. And so they just see it as a sort of a management sort of thing. And when you start to try to have a conversation about reputation, which is very nebulous, it's everywhere, and yet it's not something you can sort of fix your hands on. People just draw a blank. They really don't know what you're talking about. And it's very difficult when a problem comes up, or when something happens where people don't have a ready answer for something, because they don't know how to tie that into their usual rubric, their usual mechanisms that they're working on. So I'd like to kind of take a step back and say, look, we need, this sort of broader picture. We need this sort of bigger perspective, and why is that? So just very simply, I just have a bunch of questions here. What makes people have a particular impression of an institution? For me, the answer to this is just everything, and it's all kinds of little bits and pieces that people get. It's not only what the institution is officially putting out. So to elaborate on that, moving on to my next question here, which is more trustworthy, a slick promo video or a story you hear from your friend. So let's say, for example, you hear about an institution and you want to know something about it. And so you look at their website, maybe they have a nice video, maybe a pamphlet happens to float across your desk. That's great, it looks nice and everything. They paid some vendor a lot of money to make it look good and so on. That's great. But then at lunch you bump into somebody who just happens to have come back from there. And you hear all kinds of stuff. You hear about, I don't know, some kind of problems that were going on there, or some kind of difficulties they're having with management, or just anything. And you have to kind of imagine what sticks in your head more. The stuff that is being put out in an official way, or something that you hear from your friend. So it really comes down to just all of this information that's coming out. I just purely by coincidence, I was having lunch with a colleague today who teaches at Kyoto University, and he was saying how his students from other countries, not Japanese students, but students internationally, when they're done with their time at Kyoto University, they will go out and they will just naturally tell people about Kyoto University. They'll just naturally tell people about Japan. And it's those sorts of personal connections that people have, and that personal information that people give out, which carries so much weight, has so much of a stronger message for people than anything that's official. Of course, the official things are important too. You have to have the word from the horse's mouth. You have to have the things that the taxpayers have paid for to make the public institution look the way it's supposed to look. That is important as a sort of a basis. But then you have to be looking out for that. When I was in an institute as part of Kyoto University that was actually much more internationally oriented than the headquarters where I am located now. Um, Fortunately, the management of that institute were more in tune with this. And one of the things that they really emphasized was support for the work environment and the living environment for the faculty. And so this meant not only providing for the lab equipment or providing for staffing or other sorts of things, but also making sure that they were happy with their living arrangements, or that they were not having some kind of trouble with the mobile phone company, or that their children were doing okay in school. It may seem like it's too much, but all of these things feed into the impressions that people have about being in a certain place. So the more that the institution can do to sort of smooth over the wrinkles and kind of make people feel more happy and make their families feel more comfortable, really ties into all of this. So that, that's great. If we talk about it in a positive sense like that, that sounds fine. But if you look at it from the university management perspective, it becomes very difficult because the PR office is, as I was saying, putting out publications or a website or videos or whatever, and they have contracts with vendors to help them do these sorts of things. But then, how can they have a contract to help somebody's kids get into school, or do the deal with a parent-teacher meeting, or open a bank account? All of these sorts of things. Yeah, there are companies that do these things probably in a corporate environment, but in an academic research environment, those sorts of companies don't come into play. We don't usually work with uh, placement services and things like that. That sort of money just doesn't exist. So typically, the word on the street is that secretaries in larger offices or labs end up taking on these roles in many cases. And so you have the scientists, doing their science, being very busy and so on. And then you have the secretary who's managing the office and the postdocs and everybody, but then at the same time making sure that people's living arrangements are okay and doing all these sorts of other things. But in many ways, that's not enough because that's only the really big offices that can afford that sort of thing, that have multiple secretaries who can go out and actually go to the bank and help open the account or do whatever else that's necessary. Um, so when I was at this institute, which was the WPI ICEMS, um, we actually had a team. We actually had three people who were dedicated to doing this work and were actually taking the new staff by the hand and going with them out to do these various chores, to the immigration office to make sure that their papers were all ready, to the motor services place to make sure that they could get a license. Just all this stuff, all of these little details to make them feel comfortable about living, and it's so difficult. It's so difficult coming to Japan, not speaking any Japanese, and trying to figure out all this stuff. It's just almost impossible. If your spouse and children with you, it just becomes this enormous nightmare. So, um, being able to provide that sort of service is something that was really, really good that iCIMS was doing. Since we had a good model for that, we tried to expand it, and we actually convinced the university to place similar people in different parts of the university, and that worked for a short time. But those people ended up being too lonely. They were just like one person in the hall faculty of science or something like that. And when that happens, most people don't have the sheer gumption to sort of survive. It's just too difficult when you're by yourself and there are dozens of people who don't really care about what you're doing. It just doesn't work for most people. They don't have as sort of a thick rhinoceros hide like I do or something. So that didn't last, and I think in many ways, the leadership really didn't see that this was also a necessary function. So that's something that I regret. That as a WPI Institute, which is World Premier International, so it's supposed to be a special kind of leading edge, not only in science but also in terms of international management. It's supposed to be a way of creating a model for how these institutions should be running themselves in the future. We had something really good with this, and yet we were not able to translate it into something larger. Another kind of interesting side effect that I noticed from this is that our URA organization, our research administrator organization, had some people at the time who were interested in this, but almost because they had the compassion to worry about these issues, they themselves were also dealing with their own families and their own kinds of personal things and so on. And it caused them to eventually kind of burn out almost, that they didn't have enough leftover energy to really pull these sorts of things through for the institution. So I've digressed a little bit into this sort of research support area, but I think as a topic, it really fits into how people view reputation, how people think about whether they're being taken care of by their institution or not. So yes, I'm a communications guy, and I'm doing media all the time. I'm talking to reporters and journalists and so on. That's my main work. But wherever possible, wherever necessary, if I hear about somebody having some kind of problem, I see it as an important part of what I do to connect them to people who can help them out. Whether that means that it has something to do with a press release or a press conference or something that I'm normally doing, and it almost feels like a personal crusade, to be doing something like this, because it doesn't count for anything within the organization. Nobody in the office thinks this is important or feels that it's a worthwhile use of my time. And at the same time, the actual people who come to me with a problem or whatever, inevitably are extremely thankful, because otherwise nobody was helping them. They were just sort of on their own. So I really do see, being in the central administration, I do see the position that I'm in as being a key kind of reference point, so that people around the institution can be able to connect with things that they otherwise wouldn't know about. So I do try to do that a lot. So I'm digressing a bit. Let me move to my next question here. So what matters in terms of reputation? So I've talked a lot already about helping people on a very personal level, but to take it up to a higher level again, corporate things, corporate tie-ups, rankings, all of these things do actually have some effect, of course. We see a lot of high school students coming to the university purely because of Nobel Prize winners, or purely because of reputation associated with research. And those things feed into rankings, of course. And so there are these things, these hard numbers and so on, that come into play in certain areas. And I think that certainly helps with researchers thinking about coming to work here as well, is seeing other sort of achievements that we have in a very hard sense. So again, everything is feeding into this, all of these bits and pieces. Um, and um, rankings come up in a lot of discussions about institutions and about reputation, partly because a colleague of ours, Amane Koizumi, has done a lot of dissecting of rankings, and his general judge of rankings is that reputation figures into about 40%. Just a rule of thumb, and that's not just one part of the ranking. That's looking at different things, including things like citation score. So if you get to the bottom of a lot of the different numbers that go into a ranking, and you pool all of the bits that have to do with reputation, that's where he gets that rough estimate of 40%, which is huge. It's absolutely enormous. And yet the degree to which, especially here in Japan, our institutions are not really investing in this is kind of tragic, um, in my estimation. But at the same fancy adverts, how much money gets spent on doing advertising and so on, which maybe is not very useful. Um, that's a whole area where we see the staff who don't have experience with these sorts of things being led by sweet talking vendors. So the vendors come knowing that there's some kind of budget for something, and they present something which looks really great. Oh, this worked for so and so university. We were able to produce this for them. That's very slick. Oh, the executives will like that if we show that to them. And so this money changes hands. Yeah, huge projects result, and so on. Is something actually being done to help anybody? It's very hard to say. It's often really not very constructive. So it's something which we often discuss as being a problem, sort of endemic to the system, that the people who are running it really don't have a sense of where they want to take this. And so when there's something that comes along that looks like it may make them look good to their superiors, then that's what happens. It's very short-sighted. Um, so Ewan had mentioned about sort of leading into other things related to crisis management as well. And I do have some stories about crisis management, but I'll save them for later. But I do want to just mention briefly whether, just to have you maybe think a little bit about this. For example, we've seen in the last year some really tumultuous things happen. We've seen the president of Harvard University resign, and in some other major institutions, these sorts of things happen. But if you think about this to yourself, has that changed your feeling if you think about Harvard University? Do you yourself think that as a result of that, Harvard University's reputation is somehow tarnished or somehow lessened because of what you've heard in the news and what you know about what happened? And I'd be curious to hear from you about your thoughts on this. But there's a famous expression in American marketing, which is that no news is bad news. And or or anything, essentially anything is good news, which is that even if it's something that's terrible, the fact that your name is getting out there is a good thing. I don't think that's always true, especially the universities, because a lot of people in the academic community have really long memories. And so we're not dealing with mass consumerism or something like that. It's a very different sort of audience that we have. So, for example, the STAP scandal, to mention something very painful for a lot of people here, is something that people remember. I mean, it's not like just because it happened 10 years ago that people somehow forget about it. So, and I think that did play into the reputation of the people and institutions involved. So you do have to be careful about that. You do have to be careful about handling bad situations and handling crises, and trying to recover from that in some way. But at the same time, getting word out about an institution sometimes does involve risk, and sometimes does involve sort of a trade-off of pluses and minuses. And given that we're dealing with staff who don't have experience with these sorts of things, it's difficult because they come from an environment where every minus is just tumultuous and terrible, and it has to be avoided at all costs. And so they become very risk averse. And this is tricky, because being able to have the judgment to say, well, there is some risk involved, but it's worth it, is a step which is too far for a lot of our colleagues. It's too difficult. And trying to overcome that and say, look, this might turn out badly in some ways, but the positives far outweigh that. Being able to push the organization over that hump and get them into a feeling of doing something with a little bit of risk is really an important challenge, I think, and an important way in which we can contribute to moving our institutions forward. So I'll leave my comments there for now, and thanks very much, and look forward to hearing your questions.